It's my pleasure to introduce to you Charles Vernon Hamilton. I got your middle name from Google, so. Yes, I know. Yes, I've heard the story. Yes. Not from you, from Charles J. Hamilton. There's going to be lots of opportunity later this evening for that. So, again, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Charles V. Hamilton, the W.S. Sayre Professor Emeritus of Government and Political Science here at Columbia University. 2016 marks the 50th anniversary of when the slogan Black Power gained currency in American politics. June of that year, Stokely Carmichael rallied the cry of the slogan Black Power during the 220-mile march against fear that started in Memphis, Tennessee, and ended in Jackson, Mississippi. That cry was followed by one of the most important books ever written, in my view, on Black political life, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, written by Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, and Roosevelt University professor, Lincoln University professor too, I've been told recently, Professor Charles V. Hamilton. The book defined a generation. After a half century, Black Power is still in print. It remains a staple in courses in African American studies and political science courses on race and politics. And the book's analysis still holds relevance today. Black Power raises questions about the viability of in-group political solidarity, the complexities of coalition politics, and the hidden forces behind racism. Indeed, it was Black Power that defined and coined the concept of institutional racism, a framework for understanding the persistence of racial inequality that has resurfaced in our current politics. Black Power, of course, is not Hamilton's only work of brilliant scholarship. Other books include The Bench and the Ballot, Southern Federal Judges and Black Voters, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., The Political Biography of an American Dilemma, and one of my most favorites, actually, The Dual Agenda, Race and Social Welfare Policies of the Civil Rights Organizations, which was co-written with his spouse, the late Donna Hamilton. And I should note that this two-day event and conference for Hamilton is being held in Donna's memory. Dual Agenda, along with Black Power, will be the focus of tomorrow's panel discussion, so I hope many of you can still come out to hear it. It too remains an important book. Dual Agenda points to the limits and the necessities of universal and targeted public policies directed toward Black and other marginalized communities. I should also say something about how Professor Hamilton's lecture here today and the conference in his honor came to be. Last December in dreary Oxford, England, I was invited to a conference at Nuffield College on Black electoral politics in a colorblind era, organized by Professor Desmond King, who's here this afternoon. The conference papers explored themes that have been prevalent in Black politics for nearly half a century, but still remain on the margins in the study of American politics writ large. At the conclusion of the conference, I discussed the irony that we were at Oxford discussing concepts like deracialization and targeted and universal policies when pioneers of the field had been grappling with these issues for most of their careers. I talked in particular about the late great Haynes Walton and Kimberly Johnson, Barnard College political science professor and my co-convener for the Hamilton Conference, talked about Charles Hamilton. On our return to New York, Professor Johnson suggested that we hold a conference in honor of Professor Hamilton, and so here we are. So I'd like to say to you, folks, to get ready, buckle your seats, and get ready to receive Professor Hamilton or Mr. Hamilton on this side of Broadway, Professor Charles V. Hamilton.
Fred and Kimberly gave me 12 minutes. I'm going to take a little longer. But first, thanks for this honor. And I especially appreciate your allowing me to dedicate this to my comments to the memory of my wife of 60 years, to Donna, who was also a graduate of the School of Social Work, doctoral recipient. And what I have to say today, and have said over the last 6 decades, will have the clear imprint of her care, love, and criticism. She had a lot of all those 3 things. Now, and we did many things together over those 60 years of marriage. I thought I had a handkerchief. I do. But I remember her final days, we were chatting, and I indicated that, 60 years, my gosh. And a lot of times people ask me if there were any things I would do differently over those 60 years, and I say, you better believe it. But I also said to her, there was no one else I'd rather do them with. And I miss her very much. Okay, now listen. One other point, my topic is taking democracy seriously, Black power politics, coping with political change. It's a rather broad topic. And I must also say you must be always aware of visiting lecturers come bearing broad titles. But in this case, I've decided, and you've helped me, I'm going to focus my few remarks on the 3 panels you have listed for tomorrow. I think that would be the most respectful way for me to do this. And I will not deal with the 4th one, the 3 panels, and I will not deal with the 4th one, which talks about the multiple legacies of Hamilton. I'm not going to go there. In my advancing years, I'm not presumptuous enough to be that prescient. So, but on the first panel topic, that one, starting with Black Power, past and future. When Kwame and I wrote that book, well, it was Stokely then, we clearly had in mind a definition that was it was not a definition, it was a slogan. And we said before a group can enter the open society, it must first close ranks. Now, we just thought that was a good thing to say, and it was reasonably clear. And our focus was very clear. It was on organizing potential voters in Lowndes County and Macon County, Greenwood, Mississippi. And closed ranks, however, came to be a call for separatism. It came to be a call for kicking whites out of the civil rights movement and going it alone. But it's very clear to me that that wasn't what I had in mind, and it certainly wasn't what I don't think Stokely had in mind. But it was a slogan, it was a rallying cry, and it's very clear that other pundits and scholars would have their own interpretations, and in wise they did. But it's also clear it became part of the public domain. And we no longer controlled it. And we never did control it. And I remember Dr. Kenneth Clark. Many of you know these names. He called it a shoddy moral product disguised in the gaudy package of racial militancy. All right, well, Ken and I were friends. We seldom spoke, but Hilton, his son, was one of my students in this university as an undergraduate. And I objected to that, but I also came to understand that, quote, black power, unquote, close quote, was not ours to keep or to define. Social movements with slogans, and it was the slogan. It was a rallying cry. Cannot be copyrighted. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, and every social movement, all of them have these terms. I recall Sam Huntington, Professor Huntington, writing in his book, to campaign for black power is to go down a dead-end street. But if you crusade for equal rights to open up, however slowly and creakingly, doors to new opportunities, then they will listen to you. Now, if Ken and Huntington were off the base about the meaning of black power as far as I'm concerned, I must admit to you I was very naive. Very, very naive. Wasn't my first fallacy, but because I believed firmly in the often quoted phrase, close ranks. And I really believed, naively or not, that if you close those ranks, you must cleanse them. It's not any organization like we were movement like we were putting together that was so open and so honest about and so clear about our targets, segregationists, lynching mobs, had to be a moral struggle. But it's also clear that if you have such an open movement like we had, there would be people, your own friends, who would come in and corrupt it. They would be there for their own self-serving purposes, money, celebrity. Now, I could elaborate this, but there's no need to. Everyone here understands what I'm saying. And I think that that was one of the first mistakes I made in assuming that all those people who joined us believed the same thing we believed. They did not. Now, Now, I'm from Chicago, and I know about corruption in internal ranks. So I have no excuse for being that naive. But if we close ranks and don't cleanse them, then we are corrupting our own struggle. That was true then, it's true now. I never would have believed that all these people we were electing, mayors, city council people, would then go on the tape. I just didn't believe it. Well, okay. Now, that's not a simple thing and proposition to state. I'll tell you that one of the reasons, and I'll give examples because that'll make it more reasonable. What time did I start? No, because I am going to... This is fine.
You're good. It's fine.
Well, now, I don't want any bell ringing around here. Because to say cleanse your ranks has a little witch hunt kind of sound to it. Now, I'll give you an example. I wrote a book about Adam Clayton Powell. And I failed the test. It was very clear that Adam Powell, was one of the best leaders in his role in his early years. There's no question of that. With the Powell Amendment, he raised an issue in the 40s and 50s from Congress that Bill Dawson wouldn't raise. Whether he should have or not, he raised it. But in his later years, he became his own worst enemy. And we protected him. And we protected him because John O. Franklin taught me this. Well, there's sometimes you just simply must call your best friends out and kick them out. So I say, and I thought everybody would be a John Lewis. That has to be one of our first lessons as we go forward in this different period now. Because these people will only hold us back, and they're our own. Now, let me move to the second one. Universalism, target policies, or something else. I like that because it has a question mark behind it, and it gets to the dual agenda. I didn't think that this is a topic that needed much clarification, but obviously it did, because the answer is both. You want targeted policies and universal policies. And you don't have to go back further than the New Deal to show that the black civil rights organizations always understood this. Always. Now, I have to be personal. Let me just say that the National Urban League and the NAACP, along with others, advocated for the inclusion of black workers in the first tier of the Social Security Act of 1935. But that didn't happen. 2/3 of the black workers were excluded from the initial Social Security Act because of agricultural workers and domestic workers. Now, the civil rights groups supported the progressive Lundin bill. They wanted to be included, not targeted out. but didn't happen. It was not until the early 50s that a reasonable majority of black workers, not unemployed people, workers, were included in the first tier of the Social Security Act. Donna, my wife, very clear when she wrote her dissertation on that subject. But as late as 1991, a Harvard professor, Theta Scotchpole, just to name it, wrote, civil rights groups tend to be preoccupied with defending affirmative action or pushing for measures targeted on the non-white poor. She was thoroughly wrong, totally wrong. The historical record will always show that the civil rights groups have always had a dual agenda. They were never us, not them. We were always for inclusion. And at the same time, special treatment of our own separate problems. Now, I suspect the mistakes some of these people made was not exciting enough intellectually to argue, but they were wrong. And if we don't understand that there are these dual agendas which are not conflictual, take away the question mark, underline the whole sentence. Civil rights groups have always understood this. They simply haven't had the sufficient allies to coalesce with. That's going to lead me to the third panel, the deracialization. Now, that's where I had my head handed to me a number of times, but I kept putting it back up. This was probably the most provocative suggestion I made, and was probably my fault. I was asked by the Democratic Party in 1976 to draft a statement for the party platform committee, and I did. And in it, 1976 now, I suggested that in that presidential election, I mentioned that there should be great emphasis on issues that cross socioeconomic lines, you know the language, class versus race versus that. I didn't have that when I taught here. Now, and I mentioned strong support for the Humphrey Hawkins bill, all that, universal health care. Now, those were examples that I talked about in my piece on deracialized solutions. Well, Now, but the New York Times, Charlene Hunter Galt, subsequently ran a piece, Black Professor Urges Softening of Racial Issues. Well, that's all you have to do. That's all it is. That's the media. Now, I had my head handed to me and by my friends and my colleagues. Later, I tried to explain that I was not calling for softening of civil rights, but a political strategy for that particular presidential campaign. I assumed I was clear, but that was wrong assumption. Okay, now I would sum up these observations We are, I would argue, and we speak to a lot of my colleagues, some of you in the room, we talk in terms of particular eras. Historians do this, social science, political scientists. We talk of the civil rights era, the post-Reconstruction era. Good, solid. Even now, post-Obama, we talk about, doing it since Obama, we talk of the post-racial, fine. But you see, and I think that those categories are functional, useful. I don't argue with them at all, but I want to suggest one thing. I see it as a continuing struggle to cope with constant change. And in that process, you're going to have different leaders under different circumstances pursuing different strategies at the same time. And we've got to come to terms with that. And I'm going to tell you this. If it is the case, and it is, that blacks will need allies, and they certainly will, then I'm going to suggest this is going to be, you may want to yell at me, but don't yell, ask. I don't think, and I'm coming to the close, and I'm coming to the current. I think that the current situation is such that it's very clear, and we don't need to debate a lot of other things that are important, but that we are now in a situation where the one party has a civil war within itself. That's fine. Done that before. But what the Trump campaign has done, it has succeeded, in my mind, of legitimizing the notion of racial ethnic nativism in this country. It has legitimized the idea that certain racial, ethnic, religious groups no longer need to be considered as real Americans. Now you can talk about that now. Well, we better understand, whether he wins or not, that is now a legitimate subject to put on the agenda, and that's crucially critical to our democracy. It shouldn't even be talked about. I would finally say, and I've got one page to do it, therein lies the coalitions. Blacks will need allies, always will, but the whites must provide them. Black people cannot, in this time, nirvana perhaps, but not now, organize white people. That is a function of a progressive white movement. And the progressive whites must now close their ranks. Their ranks. Not just with blacks, but with whites. And these white progressives who fear plutocracy and authoritarianism as much as I do, or we do, almost must also now close their ranks and ally with blacks and with effect viable coalitions. Blacks have been doing this all their lives. That's what the dual agenda was all about. They simply have not had sufficient white allies. I think what is on the agenda now, my friends, is that progressive whites, and they're a whole mess of them, pray, must now ally with us by closing their ranks among themselves. And we're going to remain, in the future, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-gender society. These identities, and I never like that term, politics of identity. Of course there are identities. We're always going to have these, and culturally, I think that's good. I like celebrating Irish Day parades and Puerto Rican parades and all those I like eating Italian food and, and so forth. What's wrong with that? We don't, those are identities, cultural identities. We want to hold on to that. And if we remain knowledgeable about the validity of these identities, then these distinct identities can also have common interests. And I say to you, it's a reasonably clear afternoon. I think that is our challenge, and that is the nature of Black power politics now coping with social change. I will entertain, after the panel, only friendly questions.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. You'll always be Professor Hamilton to me. I just want to say for folks who are standing in the back and on the sides, there actually are other chairs there if you want to just come in and sit down. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kimberly Johnson, and I'm a professor of political science and urban studies at Barnard College. And I also have to say that I got my PhD here from Columbia, and I was Professor Hamilton's TA for Introduction to American Politics. And so while we're celebrating Professor Hamilton for his amazing scholarship, I also want to not forget that he was an amazing professor and mentor. And I still use, updated of course, many, many examples that I learned about how to sort of reach and control a room full of 100 or so undergraduates. That is an amazing skill and not to be underrated. So let me just sort of talk about a little bit about the next steps. So what's going to happen is that we have 3 panels. I'll introduce them in a minute. They'll speak for about 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then our hope is that Professor Hamilton will respond, and then we'll also have time to open up the floor to questions, only friendly questions, from the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to start from my immediate left. Joining us in responding and kind of thinking about Professor Hamilton's comments are first Professor Michael Dawson. He's John D. MacArthur Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. Dawson's research interests are vast. He's well known for his work on political behavior, identity, and public opinion, the political effects of urban poverty, and African-American political ideology. His work also includes several influential books, including Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African-American Politics, as well as Black Visions, The Roots of Contemporary African-American Political Ideologies. That last book won multiple awards, including Black Visions, winning the prestigious Ralph Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association. Dawson has published many things. He's currently working on 2 projects, Fragmented Rainbow on Race and Civil Society in the United States, as well as a solo volume, Black Politics in the Early 21st Century. To his left, we are joined by Diane Pinderhughes, Notre Dame Presidential Faculty Fellow, Professor in the Department of Africana Studies and the Department of Political Science, University of Notre Dame. Professor Pinder-Hughes' research addresses inequality with a focus on racial, ethnic, and gender politics and public policy in the Americas, explores the creation of American civil society institutions in the 20th century, and analyzes their influence on the formation of voting rights policy. Her publications include Uneven Roads, an introduction to U.S. and racial and ethnic politics, Race and Ethnicity in Chicago Politics, a reexamination of pluralist theory, Black Politics After the Civil Rights Revolution, collected essays, which is forthcoming, Race, Gender, and the Changing Face of Political Leadership in the 21st Century America. Professor Pinder-Hughes is also past president of the American Political Science Association. To her left is Nikhil Paul Singh. He is professor of social and cultural analysis and history at New York University. He is the author of a number of books, including the award-winning Black as a Country, Race, and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy. He has published books and articles on topics ranging from liberalism to the role of race in U.S. foreign policy, including a forthcoming book, Exceptional Empire, Race and War in U.S. Globalism. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. You can sit there or you can come up. It's up to you. In the order that I called you. All right.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Kimberly and Fred for inviting me to discuss Professor Hamilton's work. I am truly honored to do so. I want to talk a bit about the impact that the book Black Power had on my generation's activism and scholarship, and then say a bit in the spirit of Professor Hamilton's comments this afternoon about the continuities and discontinuities from then to now. When I first read Black Power, I was not a scholar. I was barely a student. Claire Drake, a contemporary of Professor Hamilton, my first mentor, complained to one of my peers at the time that I needed to make up my mind whether to be a student or an activist. I chose activism. It would be nearly 20 years before I could even claim to be beginning a career as a scholar, and Black Power had a profound effect on the Black movements I was part of. Similar to that of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the works of Malcolm X, James Boggs's Racism and the Class Struggle, and Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. There was a canon of works about Black liberation that serious activists read, analyzed, and argued over, and Black Power was arguably the most influential, and all are worth reading by today's activists and scholars. For example, when I was a member of the Black Student Union at Stanford, we were under attack from both the liberal Black community, specifically the NAACP, as well as much of the white left, for insisting on the independent organization of Black radicalism. And let me be clear, we had members in the Black Student Union who belonged to the NAACP, to the Nation of Islam, to many predominantly white radical organizations, but we also insisted there was a need for independent Black radical organizations. When a white communist grad student told me that because he was a communist, he could organize the Black community of East Palo Alto as well or better as I could and my colleagues could because he was a communist, I consciously pulled from the book Black Power. It just started yelling in my head. And I stated, if he was such a powerful communist, then he should go organize the white working class communities that at the time surrounded Palo Alto and Stanford. He declined. The theory from books like Black Power, combined with our own experience, provided a valuable guidelines for our activism. And as we're at the beginning of a new period of Black youth activism, to date activists will need to develop their own canon and find their own answers for charting a path forward for Black liberation, as all groups dominated by systems of oppression need to do. Eventually, I found my way back to the academy and followed the footsteps of Hamilton, St. Clair Drake, and the others who had studied Black folks with rigorous intellectual determination, albeit I used somewhat different methods. Despite the resistance I found in graduate school and the discipline of political science to studying Blacks, I stubbornly insist on doing so because another insight found in Black Power that I knew must guide my scholarship. Race is an overwhelming fact of life in this historical period. This has not changed, as we see not only from this presidential campaign, and not only from the continued murders of African Americans and young Black people by both members of civil society and the state, but also by rebellions in places such as Baltimore and the organizing that's occurring among young black people in movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the BYP 100, and many other local, regional, and national organizations. When I was an assistant professor in Michigan, one of my senior faculty members who voted against tenure for me argued that the only important chapter in Behind the Mule was one when I compared black attitudes to white attitudes. Studying black folks on their own merits was not worthy of tenure in the top political science department. Too many political scientists and other scholars seem to agree with this point as they publish articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education and the Annals analyzing this electoral cycle without analyzing the role of race. So one of the questions that has motivated me my entire career is to what degree is it possible? What are the conditions of possibility for, as the authors of Black Power insisted, for closing ranks? Out of this research developed the idea of linked fate, which is often somewhat misunderstood. It is still the case that the overwhelming majority of blacks believe that their fate is linked to that of other blacks. But how that gets translated into action is highly dependent on perception of interests, ideologies, organizational affiliations, and the racial and economic climate of the times. Closing ranks is far more difficult today, both due to the black elite embrace of neoliberalism, but also due to the partial victories of the 1960s and 1970s. With the massive democratic victory of the dismantling of Jim Crow, one of the key bases for class alliance within the black community has disappeared. There are still issues such as particularly state violence aimed at blacks and the discrimination that blacks continue to face in markets, including labor, loan, housing, and consumer markets, that can bring blacks together. But interests have diverged even more than was the case during the era that the book was published, and we should not underestimate the implications for black politics. Today, as Professor Hamilton has demonstrated in his talk, many of the key questions that were addressed in Black Power are still critically important for these times. Perhaps the most critical question we found in the book's was found in the book's preface. What road forward for black people? An equally key question then and now is what is the proper target of the Black Power movement? The author position at the time was the white power structure. But in the afterward, in particular the afterword that was written, I believe, in the 1990s, they showed that there were black capitalist and anti-capitalist wings of the Black Power movement, and that the former embraced a key aspect of the system, the capitalist social order. I am, as people who know my work know, I am the product of the latter wing, the anti-capitalist wing of the Black Power movement, and as a scholar, believe that we still are facing as mutually reinforcing systems of white supremacy and racial capitalism. A third critical question addressed by the book and the talk is who are the allies and what are those fighting for black liberation? And I'll talk a bit about all three questions in the next few minutes as I conclude. Groups ranging from the Nation of Islam to the Black Panther Party had statements on what they believed and what they demanded that prominently addressed all of these questions. And the answers to these questions are no less urgent today. Black power remains an important concept to grasp and embrace in a society where people of African descent continue to be marginalized, oppressed, and subordinated. This should be intuitively obvious to the most casual observer, a phrase I learned in a city called Cambridge, in the midst of an election season where Donald Trump has embraced so-called white nationalists, has built a campaign based on racial attacks on Latinos and Latinas, Muslims and blacks. Consequently, a new BLM has arisen. There was a black liberation movement of the Black Powers era, and today the Black Lives Movement is once again mobilizing against anti-blackness that once again is a visible feature of public discourse. However, consistent with Professor Hamilton's lessons that he shared with us today, the revolutionary leader of Guinea-Bissau National Liberation Movement, Amilcar Cabral, argued, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." Hamilton argues we must not be paralyzed by fear of criticizing our own or ourselves. A call for black power cannot be used, as Professor Hamilton so eloquently argued, to prevent us from criticizing and exposing frauds and charlatans who use black or any other type of progressive unity to opportunistically advance their own agenda. We do have to be careful about how we conduct criticism debate. I'm old enough to remember when I was a teenage activist on the West Coast and saw how rumors and misinformation led to massive amount of discord in black and other progressive movements, occasionally extremely violent discord that led to activist deaths. Well, we do have to have a vigorous democratic debate about which way forward, and increasingly complicated, as Professor Hamilton has persuasively argued, dangerous times. These dangerous times, to use the Hamilton's phrase, requires a dual agenda. One of pursuing goals by organizing black communities and entering coalition. This remains the case not only in the policy level, they argue, but also on the organizational level. Reading Black Power, I was sometimes depressed by the fact that we're still fighting the same dangerous battles. There's still blacks that claim to be on the left, including some black political scientists, give me a drink and I'll name names, who argue that talking about anti-black police brutality, I'm cheap. I'm sorry, Charles. It doesn't take much to corrupt me. Just who argue that talking about anti-black police brutality, racial disparities in health, poverty, is to forestall a politics of class. I'm sorry, but this argument was dangerously idiotic over a century ago when Frederick Douglass, his son, was told that the left could not fight lynching because it divided the working class. It was dangerously idiotic during the period Black Power was written, when activists of the black workers movement were told that paying attention to the super exploitation of black, brown, and Asian workers in the US would divide the working class. And it's a dangerous argument today. A dual agenda must continue to be followed. And in these neoliberal times, however, I would argue that probably the greater danger is not from our colleagues on the left who fail to see how race still dominates much of how capitalism operates in this country, but from the fragmentation of black and other communities of color as the limited economic gains derived from neoliberalism has made relatively new black middle and upper classes willing to accommodate themselves to a world in which they have fairly open, if in not all cases, access to the privilege that partly shields them from racial subordination. Many who champion the fight against poverty and racialized oppression found in our poorest communities of color are now more comfortable with the ideal that only very slow, if any, incremental progress is possible to address the problems of those caught in the vice of multiple systems of domination, including those of class and gender in addition to race. The Black United Fronts that were common, if difficult to forge, and often fragile, of the Black Power era, even more problematic today due to the enticements that neoliberal ideology and to a lesser degree neoliberal policy offers to many affluent blacks and others on one hand, and the desperate poverty described by Sudhir Venkatesh and many others that make it extraordinarily difficult for the most devastatingly disadvantaged communities to organize. These conditions found in black and other marginalized communities are different today than at the time of the Black Power's publication. Which brings me to the question addressed by Professor Hamilton of periodization. The U.S. was one of the first states founded near the beginning of the era that has been dominated by racial capitalism, using the term Cedric Robinson first wielded with great analytical power. Several of us have argued that to understand changes in the racial terrain in the U.S., we have to understand the changes in capitalism as well. Brilliant theorist and auto worker James Boggs analyzed these questions for the Black movement in works including his book, Racism and the Class Struggle, and used the theoretical framework of internal colonialism. Many years later, Manuel Barrera did the same for the Chicano movement in his book, Race and Class in the Southwest. Today's activists and scholars need to conduct similar analysis for these times. And as Professor Hamilton has suggested, we are in the beginning stages of a dangerous new period of economic and racial crisis engendered by the rapaciousness of neoliberalism and the subsequent breakdown of the deal where some of the super profits appropriated from internal and external colonies were transferred to the predominantly white middle class and a segment of the white working class. Trump's candidacy is no more than a symptom of the breakdown, as I've argued, of the bargain made with some sectors of white America, where white and male privilege will be combined with a small share of the economic spoils of super exploitation and colonial expropriation for class peace in the U.S. and elsewhere. As we see in this electoral cycle, too many are all too willing to believe it when they're told that their problems are due to brown, yellow, and increasingly black immigrants. It is the fault of those greedy blacks in their dangerous ghettos still looking for a handout. And it's due to those who have prayed differently than they do. None of these groups are ever considered to be fully citizens, as Professor Hamilton has pointed out numerous times. But now, for all too many, some of these groups are slated for removal from these shores, while the rest of us will be under an increasingly militaristic form of racial domination. Trump's message in some ways is more insidious than even displays on the op-ed pages of key newspapers. His message is not only stating that the election is illegitimate because it's rigged. It's not illegitimate merely because the denizens of inner city's favorite hobby is vote fraud, even though I am from Chicago. No, it's illegitimate because people like most of us in this room, because the residents of barrios and ghettos, because those who pray at mosques or synagogues are the wrong type of Christian church, have no business, even as demonstrably legal citizens, making decisions about who should run this country, or more fundamentally, having a voice in shaping the society, its public policies, and its political institutions. Professor Hamilton challenged those of us, and I'm more than willing to go into more detail during the questions and answers, but I'm going to conclude by saying Professor Hamilton challenged those of us to embrace different identities, pursue common interests, and I couldn't agree more. The question is how. Let me conclude by suggesting that there are continuities and discontinuities between the time when Black Power was written and today that can illuminate but not fully answer this critical question. A couple areas I don't have time to talk about is the nature of how internal colonialism has changed in the face of liberalism, and how the coalitions have changed due to the growth of non-white populations. But they also conclude the book by stating that there was a spark of hope. The black intellectuals coming home, unquote. Some did, but many over the years did not or left again. There are not enough black intellectuals any longer actively working to analyze and attack the problems of the most disadvantaged members of our communities. This is changing once again, and we're seeing the active collaboration of activists and progressive scholars and compromisingly collaborate in order to advance the cause not only of black liberation, but the liberation of all those who remain dominated by systems of oppression. Let's strive to ensure that this work is carried forward in the tradition of the landmark book, Black Power. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My talk will be a little bit different. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not an activist. No, we're not going to fight. This is a remarkable opportunity to reflect on a half century of ideas. I think it's also brilliant to do it in the year of Hamilton, you know, that one on Broadway. I'm happy to be with you to honor Professor Charles Hamilton and his ideas, including Black Power at 50. I had the opportunity to get to know Professor Hamilton and Donna Hamilton at some points in our careers and also in our summers, and it made an important difference in my life. So, in terms of my comments will be really following the frame of the address that Professor Hamilton gave. So I'll talk first about his discussion of Black Power. I was sort of surprised that you focused on the closing ranks point. In many senses, I saw the focus on the controversy about the concept as residing in the actual term Black Power, which, as I recall, since I was there at the time, seemed to generate considerable hostility, revulsion, ambivalence among whites, but also among some blacks, just the very term. People didn't like that use. I like the idea that you discussed about the issue of controlling an idea is intriguing and complicated, that some take it and use it for their own purposes. I saw that in one instance in terms of some writing I did on the Persian Gulf War. I had done something for the National Urban League, and I woke up one morning and there was the then head of the NAACP using it very differently than I had written it. And so your point about the fact that some people read or use a concept differently than one is intended, you mentioned Samuel Huntington and Theda Skocpol. Some of them don't understand the point, nor do they understand the context or the broader challenges that African Americans faced. I think it was Michael Dawson who made the point about well, actually, it was you who made the point about the lack of understanding of political scientists. I think in the ways in which the challenges that African Americans face, the ways in which you conceptualize or people conceptualize approaches to black politics. The very fact, this is Michael's point, that political scientists could write about the election without talking about race, which has been the case in many decades in political science. A number of us have called for that. Nobody paid any attention to us because our work is not considered methodologically sophisticated enough, or if it is methodologically sophisticated, it moves race out of consideration, or it gets done in a way that's not really very useful. Your point about closing or cleansing ranks once the ranks are closed, that was one I struggled with because I think it's quite easy for that cleansing process to be problematic. You made a reference to it yourself, so I'll just leave that there. But I'll talk about Adam Clayton Powell, and you're noting his leadership in his early decades. And you said this in the paper, the draft paper, and also today, that you failed in your biography of Powell. I don't really understand that point. But I do think that your claiming failure is unnecessary. Why should we or black leaders be any different than other groups or others' leaders? Powell, whose career I often use in my black politics classes, since I know the students won't know of him, it's many decades, and of course they don't know who Adam Clayton Powell is or know of his work. Despite Powell's ego and his self-aggrandizement, his lack of judgment, when he was in the role of chair of the Education and Labor Committee, that gave him a unique seat to frame an enormous range of social welfare, war and poverty, and education legislation in the short period between John F. Kennedy's death and the years when Johnson was president, and subsequently followed by the end of that period with Nixon's election to office. And while he was unwise in the way he carried out his role, for sure, I would argue he still accomplished a tremendous amount. Now, I have a different perspective. I was not here in New York, in Manhattan, watching him, so you have, I'm sure I can see by that face, you'll have a lot to say about this. So then the next comment, deracialization as political strategy. You call your work on this as naive. I think not. I think, as was the case with the Toure Hamilton notion of black power, many simply couldn't grasp the subtlety of the argument. And I think deracialization, the category deracialization, is a different way of trying to frame universal policies and campaign and election strategies. How do you run for office if you're not running from a majority black district? In most instances, most of the United States is not majority black, believe that or not, from in New York City. I live in South Bend, Indiana. It's quite different. I'll grant that it's not necessarily an easy or even a successful approach, the deracialization approach, but it is a way to position oneself to campaign outside of majority black constituencies. In other words, blacks can be leaders in places other than Washington, D.C., where I was born, New York City, south side of Chicago. This concept was widely discussed, deracialization, and chewed over by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, including the excellent volume edited by Georgia Persons, and including many important chapters by Joe McCormick and a number of others. And in fact, one thing I wanted to say, just as a comment, sort of a side comment, it's interesting how often Professor Hamilton's ideas and concepts were discussed and critiqued directly in the national media, some of these based on what you described in your paper. Many of you teach write about issues of importance that are currently in the national framework. Maybe some of you work on or publish an op-ed, but it's not often the case that what you write is considered in public and is drawn upon by partisan organizations. People don't come to us, we come to them trying to get them to pay attention. So whatever dissatisfactions or regrets may lie within the Hamilton brain about how people responded to you, it's very much the case that those ideas were extremely valued by your peers. I got a perspective on that just this afternoon when I arrived, and Professor Harris shared a news article with me of your actual appointment here at Columbia. It was published in the New York Times in February 1969. Most of us were really happy when we got our jobs, but the Times certainly didn't publish an article about it. So the beginnings of your career at Columbia put you in that national spotlight, and you used it, which was really a wise thing to do. And then the last comment about your point about the black struggle being a continuous one. I'm going to use this term, and you'll be shocked. The black political struggle is a continuous one, and the Trump campaign. You don't expect those. And the Trump campaign. I know it's not a sentence, but I'm just putting them together. As Hamilton has stated in his draft keynote, Trump's campaign has legitimized, I would say re-legitimized, racial and ethnic nativism, that certain groups, quote, unquote, no longer need to be considered normal American citizens. A few weeks ago, I would have talked about this presidential campaign as one of fear and anxiety, and of course those feelings are still there, but I think it's possible, even probable now, that Trump will go down to resounding defeat. Clinton will be elected with almost unanimous support from blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, some groups such as Muslims, and split support from whites, especially white women. One of the many questions that remain is whether this will become a new electoral or partisan coalition of sorts. There are predictions, for example, that reliably red states such as Nevada, Georgia, and Texas may be shifting towards Clinton. I think we would undermine the achievements of this last half century if we did not recognize that this is actually one of the fruits of black power. It might also be the case that Trump supporters might become an important minority, not racial, but white minority, partisan coalition in the wake of this election. Unfortunately, I expect he will continue to be active in the public, whether as a would-be politician or the would-be creator of a television or perhaps Facebook network. I suspect he'll be as successful in this effort as he has been in the other Trump brand sales, the steaks, the vodka, the Taj Mahal, the university, and all his other investment opportunities, which were just occasions for him to extract funds from the public. The average American public that is white to lean towards Trump, however strongly, will have to decide whether they will want to come to terms with an end to with the creation of the kind of polity that Hamilton described at the end of his talk, but whether they'll want to come to terms with an end to white supremacy, male hierarchy, and heteronormativity. Whatever the outcome on this specific point, the rise of a Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton to the presidency would not have been possible without the black political struggle for power, for black power. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here and to speak at this occasion. And thank you to Fred and Kimberly for inviting me. Being the third speaker and noting that we're pressed for time, I'm furiously cutting this down at the table. And so I'm going to read it because that way I will stick to about 10 to 12 minutes, hopefully. In the early 1990s, in a talk given not far from here, the late Black British intellectual Stuart Hall offered an early iteration of what developed into a series of direct challenges to unified conceptions of black community, constituency formation, and political action that he summarily labeled, quote, the end of the innocent notion of the essential black subject. Hall's comments centered on the culture and politics of representation, but his pronunciation on the end of innocence was more broadly significant. First, it affirmed the constructedness and mutability of racial categorization across time, space, and situation. And second, it pointed to the historical diversity, cultural and economic differentiation, and political divisions that define the social experience of people who understand themselves and are understood to be black. In recent years, we have seen this loss of innocence claim advanced upon multiple fronts, beginning with black feminists who presaged and preceded Hall with arguments about masculinist presumption within black movement politics, explorations of dual oppression, triple jeopardy, and the like. Drawing upon this legacy, interventions by Kimberly Crenshaw and others detailed mechanisms by which race and gender-based anti-discrimination law and political mobilization effaced the specific intersectional vulnerabilities of black women in particular. Advancing this line of thinking, black queer scholars such as Kathy Cohen, Roderick Ferguson, and others cited the powerful exclusionary force of normative sexual presumption and homophobia in particular within black community-based claim-making. Importantly, these scholars emphasized how racial ascription is produced and reproduced as an assemblage dependent upon moral arguments about gendered and sexual noncompliance. In the context of the public health crisis of HIV/AIDS, Cohen argued that there could be no effective anti-racism that did not attend to salient intraracial differentiation, and particularly to what she termed advanced marginalization. A third important line of thinking lacks a feminist provenance, but articulates a broadly influential line of argument against what it characterizes as the middle-class bias inherent to unitary black constituency-based thinking. This body of thought deserves a fuller accounting than I can offer here, but it has at least a couple of variants. The first, associated with Adolph Reed and Ken Warren, identifies the post-slavery itineraries of black politics within the United States, including advocacy towards both black nationalist and integrationist ends, with a corporatist conception of black community interests. It suggests that despite being articulated against oppressive forces within the wider society, internally, the domain of black politics as such has remained captive to the particular proclivities and aspirational strivings of a narrow band of bourgeois leadership. Numerous works of historical scholarship support these contentions, demonstrating how normative political idioms of racial conservation and racial uplift have been defined by investments in regulating the black poor, harvesting rents, native informancy, and brokering resources of white institutional patronage. A key conclusion this body of work draws is not only about salient class divisions internal to the sphere of racial politics, but more contentiously about repressive and anti-democratic political implications of unitary and idealized notions of black collectivity. I'm describing, I'm not endorsing any of these particular viewpoints. I really am just trying to give an overview here. A different but related version of this argument, which I associate with the writings of Lester Spence and Cedric Johnson, presents a more historically specific and politically grounded account of bifurcating class interests within the field of racial politics that developed from a context of black gains in civil rights, including degrees of access to urban municipal power, as well as limited black entry into higher echelons of corporate, governmental, and university administration. In this view, homogenizing racial constituency community claims have become a modality of neoliberal governance on behalf of a nominally diversified elite that opportunistically patronizes ordinary black distress in the service of capital accumulation, particularly at the urban scale, including corporate-centered economic development strategies and so-called pro-market reforms in labor, housing, and educational spheres that in fact deepen race and class inequalities. Finally, I would provisionally identify a fifth area of work contributing to the loss of innocence of the essential black political subject, the ongoing pluralization of the terrain of racial politics beyond black and white. The binary racial thinking that tends to code discussions of race in the United States is increasingly untenable in an era in which heavily racialized politics of immigration, war, terror, and torture hover in the foreground and background of our common social and economic life across borders. We live in a moment characterized by the fungibility and transferability of racial animus. Within the shrinking kingdoms of Western prosperity, militarist, toxic, and extractive modalities of disaster capitalism have brought to the fore both the enduring resonance of U.S. settler colonialism and frontier wars, for example, the ongoing Dakota pipeline struggle, as well as novel figurations of xenophobia, including Islamophobic racism, that can both amplify and compete for attention with the specific and enduring valences of anti-Blackness. The combined impact of this array of contemporary post-civil rights thinking and social experience related to questions of race, racism, and Black politics makes it increasingly challenging to think in terms of a unified concept of Black power, past and present. It further confronts us with an increasingly messy and fragmented political terrain in which particularity, including intra-racial specificity, has a tendency to override appeals to common conditions, and it arguably points to the promise, if not necessity, of a politics oriented towards deracialization, and for many, a return to class politics as an antidote to immobilizing and enervating divisions across the terrain of egalitarian struggles and policy visions. Rather than endorsing this prescription, I want to linger in the questions that Professor Hamilton has brilliantly posed to us today and over the course of his illustrious career. For what if Black politics itself, including ongoing meditations about its complexities, still holds some of the answers we seek? Here I am thinking especially about the signal contributions of Michael Dawson, Lauren Berlant, and Nancy Fraser around the concept of linked fate, the formation of oppositional publics, and the effective basis of political life, affective, that is A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, the effective basis of political life, that are specific to a history of radical confrontations with anti-Blackness itself, its intergenerational harms, its reduced human morality, and its legacies of wounded kinship. Considerations on the longer durée of Black liberation, in Charles Hamilton's words, the idea that Black political struggle represents a, quote, continuous and unbroken struggle from slavery to the present, does not necessarily entail a homogenizing conception of Black community, nor a unitary conception of Black political constituencies and their interests. What it does suggest is that racial domination constitutes both a lived and a systemic crisis within modernity, and that leading struggles against it have yielded a body of theoretical and practical experience with continuing import and relevance. Writing in the 1940s, C.L.R. James famously observed that, quote, the independent Negro movement intervenes with terrific force upon the social and political life of the nation, whether or not it is waged under the banner of democratic rights or behind slogans of Black autonomy. This was not only because of the absence of a minimal baseline of Black civil standing and political participation in the period that James was writing, but also because direct political confrontation with harm lived and felt through a prism of de facto and de jure racial definition was at its heart a confrontation with a more broadly applicable coercive authority. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. meant, I think, when he said our struggle is more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes, but the primary avenue of democratic contention against America's interrelated flaws, racism, materialism, and militarism. The struggle for Black freedom in this view is neither irreducibly bourgeois nor simply continuous, but fugitive, to borrow Sheldon Wolin's term, always at risk of defeat, and thus in certain ways fleeting because of the genuinely transformative nature of what its success would entail. This way of thinking tends to flip the question of universalism or targeted policies. For example, opposition to the particularistic and disproportionate targeting of black folks by the police neither precludes attention to the broad remit of police violence and hyper-incarceration in the current moment, nor does it suggest that police are fair if they don't racially discriminate. Rather, such opposition possesses the potential to grow both the argument and struggle against criminal punishment and state violence across borders that has crowded out other policy choices under the terms of neoliberal order over the past 2 decades. Indeed, I think this sensibility and standpoint is evident in the Movement for Black Lives platform, however messy that document is, and it infuses the work of younger activists and scholars like Keeanga Taylor seeking to push the conversation about racial justice in more radical directions. Whether this inchoate and still fragmented politics can obtain durable organization, scale, and public standing, and avoid something akin to regulatory capture by the nonprofit university complex remains an open question. But in the current context, and in terms of our considerations today, it suggests that the question of black politics is back on the agenda in a salutary way. So I'll conclude. It should by now be clear that racial inequalities are reproduced through the so-called free market, and that there is no period in which capitalism has not been twinned with racial domination. Racial violation in this way might be relatable to capitalism's erosion of a sustainable ecological future. It constitutes both a primary, Marx called it primitive, source of capital accumulation, the theft of bodies, land, labor, and resources, and it has also been endlessly productive of forms of toxic surplus or remainder. If it is necessary to confront what Lester Spence has called the neoliberal turn in black politics, and I take his challenge seriously, this should not imply a default to the conventional race blindness of Western radicalism, but a deeper thinking through of the historical basis and strategic fault lines of racial capitalism that has been the provenance of the black radical tradition. Thank you.
So I thought that maybe what we could do is perhaps offer Professor Hamilton a chance to respond to some comments, and maybe after about 5 or so minutes of that, we can open it up to some audience questions as well as responses by the panelists.
No. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'd like, and will insist on, and if I don't get, I'll sue, copies of each of those, all those 3 comments. Oh. I appreciated them immensely. Now, I want them post haste. Do whatever changing you have to do, but I want them. Before I get on the plane going back to Chicago. Thank you very much, my friends. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's what I came to Columbia for several decades ago. I knew I would get good students and good colleagues. And dadgummit, you did it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. So I think that maybe we can start with Professor Dawson if you want to respond to any of the other comments that have been made, or if you want to just go straight to the audience.
Let's go straight to the audience.
Straight to the audience.
Yeah.
Okay. So we actually have a microphone in the center if you want to walk up and talk into the microphone, or you can project. But let's just open it up and think about and talk about these really, really incredibly provocative talks that have just been given to us. And if you could just introduce yourself, that would be awesome. Great. There's a
Better? There we go. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this amazing panel. Thank you particularly to Professor Hamilton for your very inspiring words. My name is Kayum Ahmed. I'm a South African student doing a PhD in international and comparative education here at Columbia University. I have what I think is a friendly question, but premised with three very short comments. The first is, Columbia University is named after Christopher Columbus, a known colonizer, slave owner, and racist. Secondly, Columbia University is an overwhelmingly white space in a sea of blackness, and continues, despite having recognized that it occupies stolen land, continues to encroach on surrounding neighborhoods such as Harlem by creating further disturbances, gentrification, and so on. Third, we recognize that this institution, despite having produced some amazing scholars such as yourselves, continues to be a very marginal space for students, black students like myself, Native American students, LGBTQ students, and so on. And so my question is, given the wealth of knowledge and experience that you have, Professor Hamilton, in forming social movements, what advice and guidance would you give to black students such as myself to work alongside Native American students, Latinx students, LGBTQ communities here at Columbia University to decolonize this institution and to decolonize this space? Thank you.
Well, obviously I cannot do that, but I just got back from South Africa, my 88th visit. These kinds of situations offer those kinds of and those kinds of very challenging responses, subjects. I don't have an answer to you, but the only thing I would say now, which will not satisfy you, is that that's why we're here, man. We're here to cope with these things, raise these things, tickle us some more, keep questioning, keep looking. Now, incidentally, just parentheses, I'm very interested in what happened in the Republic of South Africa last. We were there. We were just there with the ANC now being put back on its heels and a whole lot of changes. I never would have predicted that. Whatever. But at any rate, now, I would never be presumptuous enough to deal with your question. I know what got me here several decades ago, and I'll tell you an anecdote that you could play on that. When I came, they said, "What do you want to teach?" And I said, "I'm going to teach a course in political modernization." That was a term we used. Some of you folks remember that. Modernization. Wally Sayer, good name is, we are friends, and Jim Young said, "Well, that's fine, but whatever you do, you have the word black in it." That's a true story. Just have the word black in it. Okay. Now, they didn't want my credentials, they wanted my presence. And I understood that. Now, I had to cope with that, and I don't know how relevant that is to your general important subject, but, and we're still faced with that. That mentality in your country, in this country, this campus, it's a continuous struggle and at many levels. I listened to the various presentations and I thought, gee, our language is really very still disciplinary oriented. You know, I followed some of it. That's why I have to read it and learn it and go back and look at that literature before I can really deal with your question. And I'm not going to be able to deal with that. I have the interest, but not the time. There's no question. But there was another question. There was another point. Yeah, well, I didn't realize there was a New York Times article. No, seriously. I know the Trib had a Tribune because I was leaving Chicago. But I didn't know the time. But
Any of the other panelists want to take that on?
yeah.
I mean, yeah, to me, I thought that when you're talking about the University of Chicago, because everything but the name applies, being in the middle of a black community with black students feeling 70%, according to a new survey, of black students feeling marginalized and disrespected on campus. In terms of how to organize the student movement, that was decades in the past. And your generation will need to figure that out. One thing I will mention, though, is that there are a number of faculty around the country being organized by Barbara Ransby at UIC in particular, who are taking seriously the question of holding these universities responsible for their history, not only with respect to African American history and slavery, but also in terms of how a university like Columbia or the University of Chicago has been a disruptive and dominant force in subordinating the black communities that are their neighbors. So one possibility is student movements hooking up with faculty at universities ranging from UIC, Georgetown, Yale, public and private universities of all types, many of which, well, all the ones that are being organized at, have a history of racial subordination and oppression in one form or another. So I think it's not just, the students aren't just by themselves, there are also faculty who are also beginning to pay attention to this, and of course staff as well, who also face their own forces of racial subordination on these campuses.
I was struck by your comments because of the fact that, you know, any university that is represented at this table is engaged in similar activities. I mean, certainly the University of Notre Dame has done a lot of the faculty or some mysterious group, but they're always associated with the university in terms of gentrifying the areas around it, creating what the students and faculty have to, you know, refer to as kind of the Notre Dame bubble. You know, the idea that South Bend is a city with maybe about 25% African American. The school system is necessarily somewhat higher than that. Many faculty tend to live in the suburbs, known as Granger, in that area. And so there's a lot of tension between the way in which the South Bend black community sees the university and its what kinds of projects it undertakes. I know, you know, as a grad student at Chicago, and that's what 60 years old. That politics of urban renewal in Hyde Park, the 1950s renewal involving the university. NYU has its own issues, which, you know, we read about in the Times. So I'm not dismissing your comment. I'm just simply saying this is not a singular situation. So it's a challenge for a number of us.
I'm going to add something very brief because I know other people want to speak. I think that we need to get smarter about how to think about kind of inside-outside strategies, which relates to the question of the dual agenda, I think, in certain ways. When the protests erupted in Ferguson and elsewhere, and especially University of Missouri, and then Yale and other places, and they filtered up to the faculty at universities. The first thing faculty start to talk about is how can we hire more faculty, and that's reasonable, but it's a very narrow kind of way of translating sometimes the questions that are out there for our consideration in terms of how do we leverage the resources of these universities, especially in urban centers, towards more access to better distribution of its resources and so forth. I'm the faculty director and founding director of a prison education program at New York University. There's a Center for Justice here at Columbia. I think maybe Geraldine Downey is here. There are people who are working inside universities to try to think about how to open them up from the inside. This is not something to necessarily laud and celebrate as like this makes these universities now, kind of cleansed of their problems. But there are ways that we can start to work along those lines that I think can actually, over the long run, it be transformative.
Any other questions? Sure.
Thank you very much for this panel, for this conference, and thank you very much. Can people hear me, or should I use the...
Go ahead.
And thank you, Professor Hamilton, for your research, which has been very important in my own doctoral studies. I was very struck about how you talked about how the notion of black power had been misunderstood and used variously. And I wanted to also ask about how perhaps the notion of deracialization has also been misunderstood. It's widely applied and it's become a very dominant way of describing how, as Professor Pinderhughes mentioned, how African American candidates in majority white areas get elected. But that discussion is often neglects the particular historical context which you talked about in your keynote, which was that it was a strategy for the Democratic Party in the 1976 election when Jimmy Carter, a white man, was the candidate, and how he could win that particular election and not fall to the pitfalls that the McGovern campaign fell to 4 years earlier. And so I was just wondering if you felt that deracialization had kind of been taken out of context and has now become a way of talking about what a black candidate should do and how they should behave in particular contexts, which was not your intention, perhaps, when you were writing the piece to begin with.
No, I don't think that it was written for a very specific context. But the concept itself, to me, is applicable continuously. You must seek to deracialize if you want allies, if you want coalitions, and that's my point. No, I'm still very, and as you move into as we move now into different situations, we had better think of deracializing certain ways we act and strategize, form coalitions, and incidentally, I would also add, these are always locally based and grow from the local up. Now, as you do that, you always seek allies. Now, allies are not going to always have the same issues your group has. Fine. But there are ways to see commonalities within your alliance. Now, this is, it's what I call political literacy, another term, and I'm going to use it, and I've used it now in the new manuscript. We must become more politically literate. formal, yes, politically literate, how to cope with these changes, different alliances at different times, different terms, different leaderships, different strategies, and let's face it, some of these allies are going to get victories within the alliance before the others. Now think about this now. Nobody in your alliance, your coalition for this issue, first of all, it may not be the same coalition for that issue. We live in a very pluralistic situation, and everybody's going to be here. We're not going to go anywhere. So let's just learn how to. All I want to do, I don't go as a former Social Workers Party, LYL person, way back in my FBI record shows how long I belonged to every Marxist, neo-Marxist, Leninist group there was. But hell, look. It's 2016, going on 17. I'm not going to live back there. So I'm suggesting, and we should stop these manufactured debates too. Namely, I don't mean this one. And this is not a debate, is it? This is a forum. Yeah, no. And I put this in my manuscript, not the one you got. Can you imagine I call it manufactured, Booker T versus W.E.B. Du Bois. The most and we use language, accommodationist, radicalist of nonsense. Marcus Garvey versus W.E.B. Oh my goodness. I call your attention to W.B. Du Bois's, man wrote so much, lived so long. His 1919 crisis piece, he said, listen, that's where he says we must close ranks. That's where you thought I created that. And he was talking about a strategy at that time, post-World War I. And he said, listen, we face a condition, not a theory. We face a condition, not a theory. Now, that stuck with me forever. So I can go in and out of LYL, I can go in, and remember when Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had this big fight with the Democratic Party in
Atlantic City.
Yeah, now give it the date.
64? 64.
I really did have to stop and think. I've had so many decades. I supported them both. I gave a little money to MF, Mississippi Freedom Democrat. They went down there, and Fannie Lou Hamer and John and all of them. And I also supported the Democrats for Humphrey, who was put in a hell of a position. You know that. A lot of you know that. Now look, no political struggle, no social movement is going to be neatly. Now we've got to learn how to do that. And if we don't learn it, we're going to lose. And we're going to retreat. And I do not believe that there's anything called irreversible situations. We can be hurt, set back so poorly, badly, that it would just sort of start all over again. But it's a continuous struggle. That's all. Incidentally, South Africa, UCT, and the university system there now. You know what's going on, you follow. And that's why I'm very interested in us being more comparative too, as scholars. I never would have predicted that the ANC would be challenged the way it is, you know. But, okay, I'm just rambling now, but.
Okay.
Ask the questions, but don't expect from me.
One more question. All right, so one more question, way in the back. Can you come up to the mic? We're actually taping this, so it's a lot better for the recording.
I was so moved and appreciative of the way that you centralized Mrs. Hamilton in this event. And it made me think a lot about gender and how we keep talking about these movements and either dropping black women out or pushing black women to the side of the discourse. So it was very meaningful to me to hear you centralize her at the center of this discourse. And I wondered if you had any suggestions. You talked about the Black Lives Matter movement. It strikes me also that we talk about you and we talk about Stokely Carmichael in relationship to the concept of black power and how rarely we talk about how 3 black women coined the concept of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's still happening. What lessons can we take from the gender politics of the Black Power movement so that we can do a better job within the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements? Because we're not doing a very good job around issues of gender. So that's my question. Thank you.
This is the last thing I'm going to say, because I started with Donna. I'm critical of a lot of my colleagues in the struggle. SNCC. Remember what that quote of Stokely's? Mm-hmm. What's the role of women in the movement? Prone. That son of a gun. He should, you know. No, I don't curse. That's not a curse word. Listen.
I like cursing, so that was okay for me. Okay.
Cursing intelligently. I'm not going to go there. No, listen. Donna. Yeah, she introduced me to the process of archival work. I used to study cases and Supreme Court cases and that sort of thing, voting turnout materials. It was my wife, and she did her dissertation on the 1930s and civil rights organizations and social welfare policies. And she could not get one permanent faculty member as a sponsor in the School of Social Work. Now you can look it up, or you can Google it. I guess you can Google it. But she stuck with it, and she wrote, and I piggybacked on her when I started thinking about women. And so she taught me that if you exclude that dimension of anything, not even half the subject matter, subject matter is flawed. Just like if you exclude the struggles of blacks in American history. It's the same thing. I'm not making sense, but there's nothing I do now, nothing I do that does not have that woman in my mind.
I think on that really great note, I just want to thank all of our panelists and especially Professor Hamilton for starting off this amazing celebration.